For more than a decade, Drew and Jonathan Scott sold America a fantasy. Hand them a wrecked house and a stressed-out family, and 30 minutes later you get a finished dream home, tears, hugs, and a perfect reveal. But peel back the plaid shirts and the power tools, and the real story of the Property Brothers is a lot messier than anything that ever made it to air. There's an ongoing lawsuit from a Las Vegas couple who say their dream renovation left them with exposed gas lines and code violations. There's the brothers' own admissions that the house hunt you're watching is basically theater. And there's a run of private health scares, from a mystery illness that nearly hospitalized their brother JD to a years-long fertility struggle for Drew and his wife that never showed up in a single episode. Let's actually dig into what's real, what's staged, and what these guys have finally started admitting out loud. Before the suits, the private jets, and the $100 million brand, Jonathan and Drew Scott were just two identical twins from Vancouver trying to make it as entertainers. Born in 1978, neither of them grew up dreaming about drywall or closing costs. Jonathan was chasing a career as a magician, even performing under a stage name, while Drew was grinding through the audition circuit trying to land acting work. Neither one was making it. By their early 20s, they were living the broke artist cliché for real, bouncing between gigs, scraping by, and watching their big break fail to materialize again and again. Eventually push them towards something more practical, stop waiting on a callback, and start building an actual business. So in the early 2000s, the brothers pivoted hard into real estate. It wasn't glamorous. They bought a rundown property near their university, did the renovation work themselves with almost no budget, and flipped it for a modest profit. That first deal hooked them. Soon they were cold calling strangers day after day, hunting for distressed properties before anyone else could get to them. The kind of unglamorous, rejection-heavy grind that never makes it into a highlight reel. Eventually they built that hustle into a real company, Scott Real Estate. But the performer in both of them never fully went away. Drew kept auditioning on the side, and after getting turned down for a reality competition show, he ended up in front of a production company that was looking for a pair of brothers to host a home renovation series. That connection became Property Brothers, which first aired in Canada in 2011 before crossing over to HGTV and turning the Scotts into two of the most recognizable faces in reality television. What's easy to forget, watching them now as polished media executives, is how long the unglamorous version of this story actually lasted. This wasn't a couple of guys who got discovered and handed a camera crew. It was more than a decade of failed auditions, failed pitches, and a real estate side hustle that had to work because the entertainment dream clearly wasn't paying the bills. By the time Property Brothers finally landed, the twins were already in their 30s, with years of hands-on flipping experience behind them, which is arguably why the show worked in the first place. These weren't watching two actors playing contractors. They were watching two guys who'd actually gutted, flipped, and sold real houses with their own money on the line, long before a network was involved. That authenticity became the entire foundation of the brand. HGTV didn't just get a renovation show. It got two hosts who could genuinely talk through structural problems, budget overruns, and negotiation tactics because they'd lived it. And for the first few seasons, that grounded, unscripted feel is a big part of why the format took off the way it did, eventually spinning into one of the most bankable franchises in the network's history. By the 2020s, the Scotts had filmed hundreds of episodes across multiple spin-offs: Brother vs. Brother, Property Brothers, Forever Home, Buying and Selling, and others, and built an operation that stretched far beyond just the two of them swinging hammers. They weren't showing up to personally oversee every wall being knocked down anymore. They were running a production company, a media brand, a magazine, and a licensing business, all while still being the on-camera face of it. That kind of scale creates an obvious tension. A renovation show that started as two brothers flipping houses with their own money eventually became a machine, juggling multiple concurrent builds, tight broadcast deadlines, and a rotating cast of local contractors who don't necessarily have the same track record or accountability as the Scotts themselves. When a show has to deliver a finished reveal on a fixed filming schedule, corners are the first thing to get squeezed. And it's exactly that tension between broadcast deadlines and construction reality that shows up again and again in the complaints that have followed the franchise over the years. Property Brothers so addictive was the format. Watch a couple tour 3 houses, then watch Jonathan and Drew transform the worst one into something unrecognizable. It felt spontaneous. It wasn't. Jonathan has openly discussed how much of that house hunting sequence is constructed after the fact. As multiple outlets covering the show have reported, participants typically already have a house picked out, sometimes already under contract, well before cameras start rolling. The dramatic choice between House A and House B that anchors every episode is largely built for the audience rather than reflecting a genuine, in-the-moment decision. This isn't unique to Property Brothers, either. It's a well-documented practice across the entire home shopping genre, including shows like House Hunters, where participants have said publicly that they already owned the featured property before filming began. The brothers have also acknowledged that the show simply doesn't have room to depict the boring, months-long reality of a real estate search. The paperwork, the financing delays, the deals that fall apart. Compressing that into a tidy narrative means smoothing out a lot of the truth. There's even a well-known case where production had to scrap half of a filmed episode entirely after the buyer picked out a house with a dangerously uneven, code-violating foundation that Jonathan refused to renovate around. The brothers have talked about that scrapped episode themselves, describing a living room floor that dropped more than 4 feet from front to back because the house had been built on unstable ground. None of that makes the Scotts uniquely dishonest. Reality TV runs on this kind of editing across the board, but it does mean the spontaneous miracle audiences think they're watching is, in reality, a heavily pre-planned production built for pacing, not authenticity. What happened to Paul and Mindy King is something else entirely. The Las Vegas couple appeared on Property Brothers not long after getting married in 2018, paying roughly $200,000 to have their home renovated on the show. On camera, the reveal looked like every other triumphant Property Brothers ending. Off camera, according to the lawsuit the Kings later filed in Clark County District Court, the house was left in dangerous, unfinished condition. Miswired electrical work, an improperly sized gas line, doors that were never hung correctly, and a dishwasher hookup that reportedly contaminated their water supply with bacteria serious enough that local health officials got involved. The Kings filed suit in early 2021 against Cineflix, the production company behind that season of the show, along with Villa Construction and other contractors hired for the renovation. They've said publicly that the company's contract entitled them to financial penalties for every day the outstanding problems went uncorrected. Problems they say have made the house essentially unsellable in its current state. Mindy King has been blunt in interviews, describing the fight as a David versus Goliath battle against a production machine with far more resources than a young couple has. Size here. Drew and Jonathan Scott were not personally named as defendants in the Kings lawsuit. A statement issued on the brothers' behalf pushed back hard on the claims, characterizing the Kings' public complaints as an attempt to pressure the production company into a big settlement after rejecting efforts to fix the remaining issues. Cineflix has denied the substance of the allegations. The case, however, has dragged on for years, with a trial date eventually set for the fall of 2024 and the dispute still generating headlines well into 2026, a timeline that, fair or not, has kept uncomfortable questions swirling around a brand built entirely on trust. What the King case really exposes isn't necessarily fraud. It's the structural gap between the two Scotts smiling on your TV screen and the web of local subcontractors, production companies, and rushed filming schedules actually doing the physical work. When a show is filming multiple spin-offs across multiple cities on tight deadlines, Quality control on any individual job becomes harder to guarantee, and the Kings argue that the family who ended up paying for that gap. There's also a broader lesson buried in this dispute about how home renovation television actually functions as a business. The hosts you see on screen are almost never the entity you're contractually bound to. That's the production company and its subcontractors. So when something goes wrong after the cameras leave, the people with the recognizable faces and the deep pockets are often, legally speaking, one step removed from the paperwork. That's not unique to Property Brothers. Across almost every renovation competition format on cable television, where the stars license their name and expertise to a production entity that handles the actual contracts, permitting, and liability. For a couple like the Kings, that distinction can feel almost beside the point. They hired the Property Brothers, not a production company they'd never heard of, but it's exactly the distinction their case has had to work through in court for years. While the business side of the Scott Empire was dealing with lawsuits, the family was quietly dealing with something much more personal. J.D. Scott, the brothers' younger sibling, who has appeared across several HGTV spin-offs, went through a frightening health collapse that started around 2019. He's since spoken publicly, including in his own documentary about the experience, describing months of extreme pain, heat sensitivity, and depression so severe he genuinely feared he was dying. The eventual diagnosis wasn't some rare disease. Doctors linked his symptoms to a severe reaction to a common class of antibiotics, known as fluoroquinolones, a condition patients often refer to as being floxed. It's a real and documented syndrome. The FDA has issued multiple black box warnings over the years about fluoroquinolone drugs and their potential to cause lasting nerve, tendon, and connective tissue damage. JD has credited a functional medicine doctor and the support of his partner for helping him work through the worst of it. And he's used his own experience since then to raise awareness of a condition many patients say gets dismissed or misdiagnosed for years. And his wife, Linda Fan, were fighting a very different battle. Fan was diagnosed with Graves' disease, an autoimmune disorder that causes the thyroid to overproduce hormones, a diagnosis that complicated their efforts to start a family. The couple has spoken candidly in interviews about the 2 years that followed. Fertility testing, medication, and ultimately turning to IVF after realizing it was their best shot at conceiving. They've described the process as an emotional loop of hope and disappointment, month after month, before finally getting confirmation of a successful pregnancy in late 2021. Their son Parker was born in 2022. Notably, their second pregnancy in 2024 happened without fertility treatment at all, something Drew has said caught them